Okay, so that is that about physical or environmental barriers in communication. Let's move to physiological or biological barriers. These are barriers related to a person's health and fitness. They may arise due to disabilities that may affect the physical capacity of the sender or the receiver. Um, Sometimes you have people who cannot talk clearly, people with poor eyesight, people who are deaf, people with uncontrolled body movements, and so on and so forth. All these are physiological or biological barriers to communication. So these physical defects in our bodies may disrupt communication. Um, For instance, while communicating, a person uses vocal speech or organs to produce sound of speech. If there's anything wrong with these vocal organs, then the person will not be able to communicate verbally very well. So, physiological or biological barriers are to be put into consideration when communicating in business environment. The person, the sender, does he have, do they have physiological barriers? The receiver, what kind of physiological barriers do they have? All these will affect the most preferred or the most suitable choice of medium or media means of communication. Okay, the third category of communication barriers are semantic or language barriers. When we talk about semantic, we're talking about systematic study of the meaning of words. Semantics is about the meaning of words. In other words, um, what each word means. And you know that sometimes we have words that have more than one meaning. So in this way, semantic barriers, which are barriers related to language, will constitute communication barriers. These kind of barriers arise during the process of encoding or decoding a message into words and ideas. In other words, the sender may have a particular meaning in mind when encoding, a particular meaning or a particular usage of the word in mind when encoding. Whereas, since the word has more than one meaning, the receiver may decode the meaning or the message different from the intended meaning of the sender when she or he relates to another meaning of the word apart from the one that the sender intended. So these barriers usually arise in business communication when two individuals do not speak the same language, or when they have substantially different levels of uh, expertise, levels of competence in the language. A good speaker of English and a terrible or bad speaker of English may not be able to communicate effectively. And this can result sometimes into misunderstanding, misinterpretation, confusion, and conflict. People may take offense because they misinterpreted or they applied another meaning to the word different from what the speaker intended. Okay, so semantics barriers have to do with words with different meanings, faulty translations, unclarified assumptions, denotations and connotations. Notations and connotations. technical jargons, and bad expression, bad use of word, bad use of language, terrible command of language of communication. Um, some languages like the Yoruba language um, have words, certain words that can mean that can have up to 5 minutes just by the change of tone. I mean, just slight change of tone and it is meaning a totally different thing. A popular example is Iga, Iga, Iga. I mean, all these words have the same spelling. Iga means calabash. Iga means time or season. Iga means 200. So, you see, the native Yoruba speaker writes such word without properly annotating them with their sound markings. A non-native speaker could use any of those three. To translate it into any of those three meanings, especially if the context of usage is not so uh, helpful. But sometimes the context of usage might be able to differentiate one from the other, but it depends on the level of competence of the decoder, of the receiver. It is also a native speaker going to use the context to determine the meaning. But if it's not a non-native speaker, a poor user of the language they may not be able to do that. And that will lead to misinterpretation, misunderstanding, confusion, and conflict. So what is that about semantics, the meaning of words, as it constitutes barriers to communication in business environment? So let's look at the fourth category, which is personal barriers. There are personal factors that can impede interpersonal communication. Personal barrier is interpersonal in nature. Therefore, these barriers are directly linked to the persons involved in the communication process, that is, the people who are communicating, the sender and the receiver, and how this influences the accurate transfer of the message. When the people sending or receiving the message are the primary barrier, maybe because of their makeup, because of their biases and so on. All these are referred to as personal barriers. So it has to do with age, education, interest, and needs or intentions that differ from person to person. So these include barriers of superiors, barriers of subordinates, sometimes being in a subordinate position imposes certain limitations. The same thing goes for being in the superior position, imposes certain limitation in communication to other people. You see, these barriers are there. The good communicator is not trying to do away with all these barriers. In fact, many times you can't do away with them. But what they can do is to be aware of them and be able to put in place things to deflect the limitations of these barriers, deflect it. In other words, a superior, let's say a superior that wants to communicate to the subordinate, maybe in an informal way, depending on the need for the communication, they decide to remove the tone of informality, to be able to break the ice and be able to reach out, be able to come across well with the subordinate within the limits of the goal of that communication. So should be aware of personal barriers. They exist in communication processes within the business environment, within the organization. Okay. In addition to personal barriers, we do have other barrier. It is the emotional or perceptional barriers. Emotional, these have to do with psychology. It has to do with mindsets. It has to do with emotions. And this is closely associated with personal barriers. It's closely associated with that because personal barriers arise from motives and attitudes. Motives and attitudes, whereas emotional or perceptual barriers have an added dimension that includes sentiments and emotions as well. Emotions such as fear, anxiety, anger, jealousy, all these act to deform or to alter the meaning of words, the meaning of the process of sending and receiving message. Interpretation or decoding done with anger or anxiety or fear will come with some coloration of all these emotions, which will distort the interpretation of the message. So if the receiver does not evaluate the information with an open mind, if they don't do that objectively, emotions, biases will color the meaning we read to the message. And this will interfere with the appropriate transfer of information and cause misinterpretation. Psychological barriers are the sixth category of barriers and is an offshoot of the personal barriers, and it's also related to emotional barriers. Emotional barriers that we just treated. So there's need. I'm coaching now. There is need to study psychological barrier as a subcategory of personal barriers because a person's attitude is shaped not only by his instincts and emotions, but also by his approach towards and his interaction with the people around him. And hence, the need for this distinction between the personal, the perceptional, and the psychological barriers. Psychological barriers. You see, our environment, the context, the cultural context, socio-political context within which we develop will determine or will influence how we communicate and how we interpret. It influences our biases of certain things, of certain groups, of certain individuals. There are cultures or societies where people are more sentimental, or let me say emotional than objective. They are not critical in analyzing information. They are more sensational. They are more sensational. In fact, it is said that the world is going more sensational. That's why people will read things on the social media, on the traditional media, and without thinking it through, without asking critical questions, they run to the streets they run out of culture. I mean, saying all sorts of things um, without thinking through. But there are cultures where people and society where people are trained, are raised to be critical and to be objective, to be straightforward, and to be honest with their emotions when they are communicating. And such societies they usually go with, I mean, respecting other people, whereas the initial societies, I mean groups of society, they tend to be very rude in communicating. While many people can do whatever they like on the social media in informal setting, but when it comes to business environment, there are things we do, there are things we don't do. There are things we cannot afford to do. There are things that people say, or there are ways people respond to other people's messages that can cost them their jobs, that can cost them contracts. So, as a business manager, as someone working in business environment, we have to be aware that there are social, psychological barriers which are which are products of the societal processes from which we are produced, the cultural context in which we are produced. And just like I said earlier, these are things we cannot totally uh, cut ourselves from. What we need to do is to be conscious of this and deliberately, intentionally try to reduce, minimize the effects they have on our communication process. Whether we are encoding, whether we are the encoder or we are the decoder, the sender or the receiver. So, difference in perception is part of social psychological barrier. Every one of us, we have our distinctive filter. Filter, cultural background, religion, and so on and so forth, ethnicity, all these act as filters in our communication process. Also, information overload leads to poor retention and causes information loss. So whenever there's some important information to be conveyed, communicators must use the written channel of communication. Prejudices are part of our psychological barriers to social psychological barriers. The biases we have against some groups, some religious groups, ethnic groups, gender groups, and so on and so forth. All these constitute social psychological barriers in communication. So there are some causes of psychological barrier. We have emotions like anger, poor attention, premature evaluation, jumping to conclusion. You don't have enough facts, you are jumping to conclusion. That's premature evaluation. That is what we've got people before. I mean, there's something like what we say, the marshal, the elect, bóyá ẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́gbẹ̀rin ló fẹ́ pé abẹ́ ẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́gbàrún meaning that don't jump to conclusion. When somebody says something or begins to say something, don't assume you know where it is ending. Because somebody can say ẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́gbẹ̀rin. That's counting things in Yoruba. It's like um when you say ẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́gbẹ̀rin, it's like ìgbà mẹ́rin, like something before it. I mean, that's like 700. So someone can say a degbe. So the degbe is a common denominator, a common factor there. So when somebody says edegbe and you quickly say edegbaru, you're about to say you don't know whether I want to say edegbaru or edegbefa or edegbeje or edegbejo. So ẹ má ṣáájú ẹlẹ́ẹ̀dẹ́. Don't jump to conclusion. Don't assume you know where people are going to end. Wait, get all your facts before you evaluate what they're saying. So lack of retention is part of it. Transmission loss, emotions, distrust. When there is trust issue, we don't trust this person. So see, many of us in our societies, I mean, we have that. Our default setting is that everybody's lying. So as the person is talking, you are waiting to catch him or to catch her without paying attention to other things. Just waiting for contradictions in what they are saying. You need to say, oh, he's just playing true to time. You know, distrust, uncertainty and doubt, resistance to change. You have made up your mind about this. There's nothing anybody's going to tell you that's going to change my mind. So this speaker starts by trying to change your mind. I gotta feel, oh no, I can't take this. I mean, by default, you are ready to discountenance, to disbelieve everything they are about to say or they are saying. False assumption also is part of the causes of psychological barriers. We have cultural barriers. These are prime barrier in external communication barrier. Cultural differences give rise to a great deal of complexity in encoding and decoding of messages, not only because of the difference in languages, but also because of culture-specific assumptions that work in the mind of the sender as well as the receiver. The mind of the sender as well as the receiver. You see, culture plays a very strong role in the way we interpret the world, including the messages we send and receive. Culture plays how, whether verbal or non-verbal communication, there are certain things that are culture specific, assumptions that that underlie our interpretation or our sending of messages, things that we just take for granted. In one culture, it may be totally different or may mean something, something terribly abnormal in another culture. In another culture, I'll give you a hint of this instance in the African culture. People traditionally, anyway, people are not expected to look directly into the eyes of an elder or superior when they are talking to them. But in Western culture, when you don't look straight in people's eyes when you're talking, you are you are deemed as dishonest. Dishonest. You see? But this is contrary in Africa. So imagine an African talking to a superior who is a Westerner, or let me say an African superior talking to a Westerner that is subordinate in a work environment, and the Westerner is looking directly in his eyes. They may think, oh, this guy is rude, this guy is confrontational, stuff like that. These are ways that culture acts as barriers to communication. So, when we communicate with other people or people with other cultures, and we insist on preserving our cultural identities and we judge other cultures as inferior, then culture becomes a barrier in communication in business environment. In fact, a good thing to do is I want to work. You see, the world has become, you see, a global village that's been like that for 20 years ago. Nowadays, world is also saying that the world is increasingly becoming a cosmopolitan uh, place. In other words, we tend to meet people from different background, different culture, sometimes different races in the same place. At work, you find people from different nations, especially if you are working virtually. You're working, and which is becoming increasingly popular. You find people from China, India, Nigeria, Rwanda. Different kinds of people, different races of men working in a place, physical or virtual. So it's a cosmopolitan platform we've got now. So a good thing to do is if you're going to be working and communicating in such an environment, it's not a bad thing to read around the culture of these people, especially when it comes to communication. I'm not talking about doing a thesis on their culture, but I know it's going to help your um, your work life so much if you have some tips about how people from different cultures that you're working with communicate, the do's and don'ts, the norm, the ethics, and so on, so that you can minimize cultural barriers in communication. You see, examples of cultural barriers include social customs and norms, cultural taboos and sensitivities, values and beliefs, cultural references and humor, religious and spiritual beliefs, power distance, stereotypes, and preconceptions. In some customs, men and women cannot stand and be talking. Uh, there are certain things that are taboo in certain cultures. Oh, maybe winking at an elder, shaking or waving at an elder, calling an elder by name, stuff like that. I remember years ago, or decades now, when this culture came to Nigeria. I don't know where it came from because for me, it's funny because I'm a very cultural person, traditional person. Entitled, entitled. I'm sensitive to some of these things. So the idea then was in the workplace we go on first names. We go on first names. So whether you are agreeing on, as in newly employed staff, and then the team lead and manager, everybody will call yourself first names. When that thing started, it's like it took the Nigerian corporate world like a whirlwind. It was the in thing then, especially because of these new banks and so on and so forth, new banks then. I knew it's not going to really last. We're in Africa. We're in Africa. Most African cultures don't go on first names with people older than them, especially in official setting. In official setting. That may sit better or well in Western culture, but in Africa, where a 25-year-old, the employee in the trade, you say go on first name, and you're talking to a 50-year-old man or woman, probably old enough to be your mother, and say go on first names. I mean, there are certain things that cannot just fit into certain cultures. I wasn't employed in any of those organizations then, but I made up my mind if I was going to be, I wouldn't go on first names with people that I'm in the minimum I'll put Mr., Mrs., or Ma, and all that kind of stuff. Because there is difference to age, difference to social status when we communicate in Africa, generally speaking. So all these things are cultural, examples of cultural barriers in communication. Imagine the kind of friction that such communication enforcement may cause between a very traditional manager and a non-traditional uh, new staff, young staff. See? So also religious and spiritual beliefs are part of cultural barriers in communication. We have organizational barriers. Uh, these are hierarchical structures, unclear roles and responsibilities, and conflicting goals that impact communication. Yes, organizations, they have structures. Many times these structures are hierarchical. In other words, they go from lower to higher to higher to higher and to the highest. There's hierarchy. It is linear superiority, uh, kind of. So these can constitute barriers in communication because let's say, uh, let's say a security man makes or has a quick observation that should be communicated to the CEO. The security man or the cleaner or the typist, these are the low level, cannot just walk straight to the office or the CEO and say, oh, I want to see the chairman, the chief executive officer. I mean, you say you are breaching protocol. So the security has to go through the CSO, then the CSO to this, and some before it gets to the CEO. Like this have to go to the supervisor, and then to the manager, then to this, and so on before. Sometimes before the message gets to the CEO, if it ever gets to them, it has lost its value because maybe it is a time sensitive information. So hierarchy can constitute barriers. That's why sometimes people now, I mean, organization have placed suggestion boxes around so that it can break or it can avoid the bureaucratic, the hierarchical structure of communication. Another thing is whether those suggestion boxes are open as at when um, or not. Okay, unclear roles. When we assign roles to individuals or units in groups, and these roles are unclear or they are overlapping, the responsibilities are overlapping, it will lead to conflict and confusion, and it will impact communication. In fact, it can bring up different kinds of barriers to communication. So, some major organizational barriers include goal conflict, organizational policies, organizational hierarchy, complexity in organizational structure, and organizational facilities. You see, while we cannot do away with these barriers, we need to be sensitive, we need to be conscious about them when we want to engage in communication processes. Which of these barriers are likely to to interfere with this communication or to water it down or to stop it, and how do I avoid that happening? How do I prevent that from happening? These are things that good communicators in business and corporate environments will think about, will be aware of. So, how do we overcome communication barriers? I've been saying this as we were progressing, as we talked about each barrier. I tried to chip in one or two ideas on how we can overcome those barriers. So, problems with communication can occur at every stage of the communication process. Considering the importance of effective communication in the successful functioning of business organization, it is essential on the part of the management to overcome or to try to overcome these barriers through the following steps. One, organizational policy must be clear and explicit and well understood by people at all levels. Organization should have adequate facilities for promoting communication. That's number two. Organizations should have adequate facilities for promoting communication. Three, proper attention must be given towards their proper and effective use. In other words, these facilities, we must give proper attention to their proper use, to their effective use. Four, the development of interpersonal relationships based on mutual respect, trust, and confidence is essential for promotion. You see, for us to communicate effectively, it is essential that an organization creates an environment where informal interpersonal relationship can develop among the people, among the staff, an environment where mutual respect, mutual trust, and confidence can thrive. We've seen business owners who deliberately sow discord, who deliberately sow disunity among their staff. Their belief is that if the staffs are united, they unite in defrauding the organization. That's a myopic way of looking at things. A business that will thrive beyond the owner, that will survive, should not have instilled in it that kind of myopic view. You see, it's crazy how some leaders deliberately, some business owners or CEOs, some managers, some head of units deliberately, they say divide and rule policy. Don't let them unite against you. It's not the best. It's not the best. If we can create an environment where people trust each other, where they trust you and they feel safe, that is where they can give you their best. That is where that is what guarantees the survival and success of your business. There should be a continuous program of evaluating the flow of communication in different directions. We can't overemphasize this. Just as we service our equipment, our cars, for instance, an organization needs to service its communication infrastructure. I don't mean the physical infrastructure alone. I mean the flow of communication in the organization. Communication experts will know how to test this. These experts could be in-house, they could be outsourced. A consultant that will come to see how is communication, to test the health of communication and organization. But many times organizations just think, people talk to themselves, to send memos, so we are communicating. If you realize the import of communication to the fulfillment of the goals of the organization, We will do well to check the health of our communication system every now and then to know whether it's in line with uh, the organizational goals. So, uh, coming to the end of the lesson, these are some take-home nuggets. You may want to consider these to help you reveal what you have done in this lesson. You ask yourself, try to provide answers to these questions. What are the common, number one, what are the common barriers to effective business communications? How can businesses improve their communication? Discuss this. If you like, you can take each communication barrier and look at how businesses can overcome them. Now reflect on your own and also check online, materials online, YouTube, and so on to see strategies or ways that organizations can use to improve their communication. So, how do personal opinions and prejudices of various individuals act as barriers to effective communication? Use suitable examples to illustrate your points. Okay, these are materials, reference material to further study. I encourage you to check them out. Check out the videos on number 4 and 5, the YouTube videos. They will help you make more sense of what you have learned in this lesson, this lecture. Okay, thank you very much. Our next topic is formal communication, reading and listening skills. We are going to be looking at reading and listening skills in formal education. Thank you for your time.